My name is Claire Morgan and if you think losing your job is the worst thing that can happen in a single day, wait until you hear what my parents did before the sun went down. I walked into my childhood home carrying nothing but a small cardboard box from my office, believing I would find comfort, advice, maybe even a hug. Instead, before the clock reached 8 that evening, I was standing in the rain with a suitcase at my feet while my own father quietly locked the front door behind me. They believed I had lost everything. They believed I had nowhere to go. What they never imagined was that the one place they dreamed of owning, the beach house they talked about for years as if it belonged to the family, already belonged to me, and I hadn't known it either. If someone had told me that morning my life would split into two completely different stories before midnight, I would have laughed. I had worked for the same architecture firm for nearly 9 years. I wasn't wealthy, but I loved my job because I had earned every promotion through long evenings, missed holidays, and more cups of coffee than I could count. My manager called me into the conference room just after lunch. The blinds were closed, and the HR director was already sitting there with a folder. I knew immediately something was wrong because no good news ever starts with HR waiting in silence. My manager tried to smile, but it looked painful. He explained that the company had lost 2 major contracts, departments were being reorganized, and my position had been eliminated. He repeated 3 different times that it wasn't about my performance. I barely heard him. All I could hear was the sentence, "Today will be your last day." I packed my desk in less than 20 minutes. My co-workers hugged me, wished me luck, and promised to stay in touch, but the parking lot felt strangely empty when I drove away. I kept telling myself everything would be okay because I still had my parents. Families were supposed to stand together during difficult seasons. At least, that's what my mother had always told everyone else. The rain started halfway home, turning the highway into a blur of headlights and reflections. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, rehearsing how I would explain everything. I wasn't asking them for money. I only needed a few weeks until I found another position. I had savings, a good resume, and years of experience. I wasn't afraid of starting over. I was only afraid of disappointing them. When I pulled into the driveway, both of my parents' cars were already there, along with my younger brother Ethan's new SUV. That surprised me because Ethan usually visited on weekends, never on a Tuesday. I carried my office box inside and found everyone sitting around the dining table. Nobody was eating. Nobody was talking. They looked as though they had been waiting for me. My mother stood first. "Claire," she said softly, "sit down." My stomach tightened. I explained everything before anyone asked. I told them about the layoffs, about the company downsizing, about how I was already planning to apply for new positions in the morning. I even tried to joke that maybe this was the universe forcing me to finally take a vacation. Nobody laughed. My father folded his hands together and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. "How much money do you have left?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Enough for several months," I answered honestly. "Then you'll be fine," he replied. My mother avoided looking at me. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, almost as if he had already heard this conversation before I arrived. I asked what was going on, and that's when my father said something that changed the direction of my entire life. "Your mother and I have been thinking," he began carefully. "You've always depended on this house as a safety net. Maybe this is the moment you need to learn complete independence." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Surely he wasn't saying what I thought he was saying. But he was. My mother finally spoke. "We think it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay for a while." I laughed because I honestly believed they were joking. "You mean, tonight?" Neither of them answered immediately. That silence answered for them. Ethan looked down at his phone without saying a word. I searched each of their faces, hoping someone would smile and tell me this was some strange misunderstanding. Nobody did. My father stood, walked upstairs, and returned a minute later carrying my old suitcase. It had already been packed. Every sweater, every book, every framed photograph from my room had been folded neatly inside. My heart dropped. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision. They had planned it before I even arrived. "You packed my things?" I whispered. We thought it would make everything easier, my mother replied, tears gathering in her eyes, though she never moved toward me. Easier for who? I asked. The room became painfully quiet. I picked up the suitcase because I suddenly understood something that hurt more than losing my career. They hadn't lost confidence in me that afternoon. They had lost it long before. Losing my job had only given them an excuse to act on a decision they had already made. My father carried the suitcase to the porch while I followed slowly, still hoping someone would stop me before I reached the front door. Instead, he placed it beside the steps and quietly said, "You'll thank us someday." Then he walked back inside. My mother stood in the hallway watching me with folded arms. Ethan never looked up from his phone. The front door closed. A second later I heard the lock click into place. I stood there in the rain for what felt like forever. The porch light switched off, leaving only the sound of rainfall against the roof. I wasn't angry yet. I was simply confused. Families argue. Families disagree. But they don't usually prepare luggage before hearing the bad news. Unless they had expected the bad news. I carried my suitcase to my old sedan parked across the street. As I placed it in the trunk, my phone vibrated. The screen showed an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another recruiter or spam call, but instead it was a single text message. ***, don't book a hotel. Drive to Seabrook Beach House tonight. The key is inside your glove compartment. Trust what your grandmother started. My breathing slowed. My grandmother had passed away 4 years earlier. Nobody in the family ever mentioned a beach house. Curious, I opened the glove compartment. Hidden beneath my registration papers was an old silver key inside a small cream envelope. Across the front, written in handwriting I recognized immediately, were 5 simple words. *** for Claire, when you're ready. ***, my grandmother's handwriting. Perfectly unmistakable. I looked back toward my parents' darkened house. Every window was closed. Nobody was watching anymore. Or at least they wanted me to believe that. I started the engine, entered the address from the text into my navigation, and watched the route appear on the screen. 2 hours and 43 minutes away. I had absolutely no idea what waited for me there. But something deep inside me whispered that the night my parents believed they had sent me away was actually the night someone else had finally called me home. My windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm as the highway stretched into darkness, the rain slowly giving way to a cool ocean breeze I could barely smell through the cracked window. Every few miles I glanced at the silver key resting in the cup holder beside me, catching the occasional reflection from passing headlights. My grandmother, Margaret Morgan, had always believed that important answers arrived quietly. If the truth has to shout, she used to tell me, it usually arrived too late. Sitting alone in my car, those words echoed louder than the tires beneath me. I kept replaying the evening in my head, searching for something I had missed. Why had Ethan already been there? Why had my suitcase been packed before I walked through the front door? Why had my parents looked more prepared than surprised? None of it felt like a family reacting to bad news. It felt like people waiting for permission to finish a plan they had already made. Around midnight my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. For one hopeful second I imagined she was calling to apologize, telling me to come home because they had made a terrible mistake. Instead, the message simply read, "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I stared at those 11 words until the screen dimmed. Harder for who? For the daughter sleeping in her car with nowhere to go, or for the parents sitting comfortably inside the home they had just closed behind her? I locked the phone without replying. Something inside me had changed. Not broken, changed. The desperate need to explain myself had quietly disappeared somewhere between the rain and the highway. About 40 minutes later the navigation instructed me to leave the interstate. The roads became narrower, winding through sleepy coastal neighborhoods lined with old pine trees and weathered fences. Small cafes sat dark and empty, fishing boats rocked gently in quiet marinas, and every few minutes I caught glimpses of moonlight reflecting across the ocean. Eventually a wooden sign appeared beside the road. Seabrook Point. Another minute later I reached a pair of white stone pillars marking the entrance to a private shoreline community. A security gate blocked the road. I frowned. The navigation insisted I had arrived, but the gate required an access code. Before I could turn around, a small security office door opened and an elderly guard stepped outside carrying an umbrella. He walked toward my car with an expression that looked strangely familiar, almost as though he had expected me. I lowered the window. "Good evening," he said politely. "You must be Miss Claire Morgan." My hands tightened around the steering wheel. "How do you know my name?" Instead of answering, he smiled gently. "Mrs. Margaret told me one day you'd come." My heart skipped. "My grandmother passed away 4 years ago." The guard nodded. "I know. She visited me every spring for nearly 15 years. She said if a young woman named Claire ever arrived after dark carrying a silver key, I was to open the gate without asking questions." He looked at the key sitting in my cup holder and smiled again. "I'd say she was a very organized lady." Before I could speak, he pressed a button inside the booth. The iron gate slid open with a quiet mechanical hum. "Follow the road until it ends," he said. "There's only one house." I thanked him, but before driving away I asked the question that had been growing inside me ever since receiving the text. "Who owns the beach house?" The old guard paused for just a second. "You'll find your answer inside." Then he stepped back beneath his umbrella. The road curved through tall sea grass until it finally opened onto a breathtaking view of the shoreline. There it was. A beautiful 2-story beach house sitting alone above the sand, painted soft white with wide wraparound porches and glowing lanterns beside the front steps. Waves rolled gently against the shore only yards away. It looked peaceful, timeless, almost untouched. I parked slowly, unable to believe a place like this existed without anyone in my family ever mentioning it. Carrying only my purse and the silver key, I walked toward the front door. The brass lock fit the key perfectly. It turned with almost no resistance, as though someone had oiled it recently. The door opened into a warm living room filled with bookshelves, polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and framed photographs covering nearly every wall. My breath caught immediately. The photographs weren't of strangers. They were of me. Me at 5 years old building sandcastles. Me at 8 eating ice cream. Me at 12 collecting seashells beside my grandmother. I had forgotten those vacations completely. My parents had always told me we rented cottages for a few weekends each summer because hotels were too expensive. Yet every picture showed this exact house in the background. My grandmother had brought me here for years. Why couldn't I remember? A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Welcome home, Claire." I turned quickly. An older woman stood near the kitchen entrance wearing a light blue cardigan and holding a tray with a steaming cup of tea. She looked to be in her late 60s, with silver hair neatly tied back and kind eyes that seemed completely unsurprised to see me. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "Who are you?" She smiled warmly. "My name is Eleanor Collins. I've been taking care of this house since your grandmother asked me to." She gently placed the tea on the coffee table. "She always said you'd arrive tired, confused, and probably without having eaten dinner." I stared at her. "You knew I was coming?" Eleanor nodded. "Not tonight specifically. But she prepared for this day years ago." She motioned toward the fireplace. Sitting neatly on the mantel was another cream envelope with my name written across the front in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. My pulse quickened. Eleanor picked it up but didn't hand it to me immediately. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes. "Before you open this," she said softly, "there's something your grandmother made me promise." "What is it?" I asked. Eleanor took a slow breath. "No matter what that letter says, you must not tell your parents you found this house." The room suddenly felt much quieter. Outside, waves continued breaking against the shore with peaceful rhythm, completely unaware that my entire understanding of my family had begun shifting beneath my feet. I accepted the envelope with slightly trembling hands. The paper felt old but carefully preserved. Across the seal my grandmother had written only one sentence. The truth begins when everyone believes you've lost everything. I broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and read the first line. Before I reached the second paragraph, I realized the job I had lost that morning wasn't the biggest secret waiting for me. It was only the reason my grandmother's plan had finally begun. My name is Claire Morgan, and if you think the worst thing that can happen is losing your job, wait until you hear what my parents did before midnight. I walked into my childhood home carrying a cardboard box from my office, believing I would find comfort, maybe even a hug, but instead I found packed suitcases waiting by the front door with my name already written on the luggage tags. They didn't ask if I was all right. They didn't ask how I was going to start over. They simply looked at me as though I had become someone they no longer recognized. I thought that was the biggest shock of my life. I was wrong. Because the same night they sent me away, I unknowingly drove toward a beach house they had dreamed about owning for years, never realizing that the only person with the legal key to that house was me. I still remember that Tuesday morning with painful clarity. My alarm rang at 6:30 like it had every weekday for nearly 9 years. I made coffee, watered the small plant sitting beside my kitchen window, fed my golden retriever Daisy, and left my apartment believing it would be another ordinary workday. I managed commercial design projects for one of the largest architectural firms in the state, and while the hours were long, I loved solving problems that other people thought were impossible. My grandmother used to tell me I had inherited her patience instead of her eyes, and every time a difficult client changed their mind for the 5th time, I silently thanked her for that gift. Around noon my manager asked me to step into the conference room. The blinds were closed. Human Resources was already waiting with a folder. The air felt strangely still, and before anyone spoke, I already knew my life was about to change. My manager explained that several major projects had been cancelled, the company was restructuring, and despite my performance, my department was being reduced. He apologized more than once, but apologies don't stop your world from shifting beneath your feet. 20 minutes later I carried my belongings through the lobby where I had spent almost a decade building a career I believed would last much longer. My co-workers hugged me. Some cried. Others promised to recommend me to companies they knew. I smiled because I didn't want them worrying about me, but the truth was I had no idea what tomorrow looked like anymore. During the drive home I kept reminding myself that setbacks happen to everyone. I had savings. I had experience. Most importantly, I had family. At least I believed I did. My parents had always said family stands together during difficult times. I repeated those words to myself almost the entire drive. It never crossed my mind that they only believed them when life was going well. Rain started falling as I turned into the neighborhood where I grew up. My parents' house looked exactly as it always had, white siding, blue shutters, the same oak tree my grandfather planted before I was born. My younger brother Nathan's SUV sat in the driveway beside my father's truck. That surprised me because Nathan rarely visited on weekdays. I carried my office box to the front porch and let myself inside with the spare key I had been trusted with since college. The moment I stepped into the living room, every conversation stopped. My mother sat on the couch with her hands folded tightly in her lap. My father stood beside the fireplace with a serious expression I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. Nathan leaned against the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. "Claire," my mother said quietly, "sit down." Something inside me tightened. I explained everything before they could ask. I told them about the layoffs, the restructuring, the generous recommendation letters my manager had promised to write, and how I planned to start applying for new positions first thing the next morning. I even laughed nervously and said maybe this would finally force me to take a short vacation after years of working non-stop. Nobody smiled. Instead, my father asked the first question. "How much money do you have saved?" I answered honestly. "Enough to cover several months if I was careful." He nodded slowly as though confirming something in his own mind. Then he looked at my mother. She looked back at him before speaking. "Claire," she said gently, "your father and I think this might be the right time for you to become completely independent." I frowned. "I've been independent since I was 24. My father cleared his throat. "Not completely." I stared at him, confused. "What does that mean?" Neither of them answered immediately. Nathan finally put his phone away but still avoided looking directly at me. My mother took a slow breath. "We think it would be best if you found another place to stay." I actually laughed because the sentence sounded too absurd to be real. "You mean after I find another job?" My father shook his head. "Tonight. There. Stay." I actually laughed because the sentence sounded too absurd to be real. "You mean after I find another job?" My father shook his head. "Tonight." The room suddenly felt much smaller. "Tonight," I repeated, convinced I had misunderstood. My mother lowered her eyes. "We've already packed your things." Every sound disappeared except the rain tapping softly against the windows. I looked toward the hallway just as my father walked upstairs. A minute later he returned carrying my old blue suitcase. It was zipped shut. My favorite jacket was folded neatly across the top. He set it beside the front door as calmly as someone setting down groceries after a trip to the store. "You packed before I even got here?" I whispered. Nobody answered. That silence hurt more than anything they could have said. This hadn't happened because I lost my job. This had been planned before I ever walked through the front door. My father placed one hand on the suitcase handle. "You'll understand someday." "Understand what?" I asked. "That sometimes people only grow when they stop relying on others." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had paid my own bills for years. I had never asked them for financial support. I hadn't even asked if I could move back home. I only wanted to tell my parents what had happened because I believed they would care. Instead, they had prepared an exit strategy before hearing a single word. Nathan finally spoke. "Maybe this is for the best." I looked at him, searching for the little brother I used to help with homework, the teenager whose college applications I stayed up all night proofreading, the young man whose first apartment I spent an entire weekend painting because he couldn't afford movers. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I picked up my office box with one hand and reached for the suitcase with the other. My mother stood but didn't step toward me. She simply folded her arms tighter as tears filled her eyes. Even then she never tried to stop me from leaving. My father opened the front door. Cool rain-filled air drifted inside. I stepped onto the porch expecting someone to call my name before I reached the driveway. Nobody did. The door closed behind me. A second later the lock clicked. I stood there listening to the sound echo through the quiet evening. It felt strangely final. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my car and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. My hands rested motionless on the wheel as I stared at the dark house where every birthday, every Christmas, every family memory suddenly felt different. Then my phone vibrated. An unknown number had sent a single message. ***, don't go to a hotel. Drive to Seabrook Beach House. The silver key is waiting where your grandmother said it would be. Trust her. ***, I frowned. My grandmother had been gone for 4 years. She had never mentioned a beach house. Curious, I opened the glove compartment. Beneath my registration papers rested a small cream envelope I had never noticed before. Inside was an old silver key. Across the envelope, written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words that made my heart stop. ***, for Claire, when the time comes. ***, I looked back at my parents' house one last time before starting the engine, completely unaware that the night they believed they had taken everything from me was actually the night my grandmother's greatest secret finally chose me. My hand stayed on the steering wheel for almost a full minute before I shifted the car into drive. The envelope rested on the passenger seat beside the silver key, and every few seconds my eyes drifted toward it as if it might suddenly explain itself. My grandmother had always been thoughtful, but she had never been mysterious. She labeled jars in her pantry, folded receipts into neat little envelopes, and believed every important conversation should happen face to face. If she had hidden a key inside my glove compartment years ago, then she had done it for a reason far bigger than a simple vacation home. The rain softened as I pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the only house I had ever called home. In the rearview mirror, the porch light flickered once before disappearing around the corner. I expected to cry. Instead, I felt strangely calm, as though my mind had become too full to make room for sadness. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. I let it ring until it stopped. A voicemail appeared seconds later. I didn't play it. Whatever she wanted to say could wait until I understood why she had watched me leave without trying to stop me. The navigation estimated 2 hours and 41 minutes to Seabrook Beach House. I entered the address from the text message, and a blue route appeared leading toward the coast. I had never heard of Seabrook before, yet the name stirred something distant in my memory. A faint image of collecting seashells with my grandmother flashed through my mind before disappearing again. I couldn't tell whether it was a real memory or simply wishful thinking. The highway grew quieter as the city lights faded behind me. Trucks passed occasionally, but for long stretches I drove alone beneath a sky slowly clearing after the storm. Around 11 o'clock I stopped at a small roadside diner for coffee. The waitress smiled kindly when she noticed the cardboard box on my back seat. "Long night?" she asked while refilling my mug. I smiled politely. "Longer than I expected." She nodded with the understanding only strangers sometimes possess. Funny how life changes in a single day. I left a generous tip, thanked her, and continued toward the coast. 40 minutes later the road narrowed into 2 lanes surrounded by tall pine trees. The air smelled different now, carrying the unmistakable scent of saltwater through the slightly open window. My phone had almost no signal, but the navigation continued guiding me toward a place I had never seen. Finally, just after midnight, a wooden sign appeared beside the road. Welcome to Seabrook Point. The small coastal town looked peaceful, with quiet streets, shuttered cafes, and fishing boats gently rocking in the harbor under silver moonlight. At the end of the main road stood a private security gate built between 2 stone pillars. I slowed to a stop, wondering if I had entered the wrong address. Before I could turn around, the security office door opened. An elderly guard stepped outside carrying a flashlight. He walked toward my window with an expression that surprised me. He wasn't suspicious. He looked relieved. I lowered the window. "Good evening," he said warmly. "You must be Miss Claire Morgan." I blinked in surprise. "How do you know my name?" The old man smiled. "Your grandmother asked me to expect you one day." A chill ran through me. "My grandmother passed away 4 years ago." "I know," he replied gently. "Before she left us, she made me promise that if you ever arrived carrying a silver key, I'd open this gate without asking questions." His eyes shifted toward the envelope resting beside me. "Looks like she knew exactly what she was doing." He pressed a button inside the security booth. The iron gates slowly opened with a soft mechanical sound. Before driving through, I asked the question that had been growing in my mind since I found the key. "Who owns the beach house?" The guard looked toward the ocean for a moment before answering. "That's a question only the house can answer." I drove through the gate, following a narrow road lined with sea grass until it ended at the most beautiful home I had ever seen. The beach house stood alone overlooking the shoreline, painted white with wide wraparound porches and warm lights glowing from every window. Waves rolled peacefully across the sand only a few yards away, their sound filling the quiet night. The place didn't look abandoned. It looked loved. I parked slowly and stepped out into the cool ocean air. My shoes sank slightly into the wooden porch as I climbed the steps. The silver key slid perfectly into the front door lock. One gentle turn, and the door opened as though someone had been expecting me. The scent of cedar wood and fresh flowers greeted me immediately. The living room felt warm and welcoming, filled with carefully polished furniture, bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling, and dozens of framed photographs. My heart stopped when I looked closer. Every photograph included me. Me building sandcastles at age 6. Me holding my grandmother's hand while walking this very beach. Me laughing beside the same porch railing that now stood only a few feet away. My parents had always told me we stayed in rented cottages during summer vacations. Yet every picture proved we had returned to this exact house again and again. Why had they hidden that from me? "Welcome home, Claire." The gentle voice made me turn quickly. Standing near the kitchen entrance was an elegant older woman with silver hair tied neatly behind her head. She wore a simple blue cardigan and carried a tray with tea already prepared. She smiled as though greeting a family member returning from a short trip instead of a complete stranger arriving after midnight. "I'm Eleanor Collins," she said softly. "I've looked after this home for many years." I stared at her in confusion. "You knew I was coming?" Eleanor nodded. "Not tonight specifically. But your grandmother told me this day would arrive." She placed the tea on the coffee table before walking toward the fireplace. Resting on the mantel was another cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. My grandmother's. Eleanor picked it up carefully but didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes. "Before you read this," she said quietly, "there's one promise your grandmother asked me to make you keep." My pulse quickened. "What promise?" Eleanor took a slow breath. "No matter what you discover tonight, do not tell your parents you found this house." I looked from Eleanor to the envelope and back again. Outside, waves continued breaking gently against the shore, completely unaware that everything I believed about my family was beginning to unravel. With slightly trembling hands, I accepted the envelope. Across the sealed flap my grandmother had written one final sentence. Asterisk asterisk sometimes the people who send you away unknowingly guide you home. Asterisk asterisk. My grandmother's final letter changed everything I thought I knew about my family. By sunrise I understood why she had hidden the truth for so many years. The beach house wasn't simply a beautiful property overlooking the ocean. It had been legally transferred into my name 6 months before she passed away, protected inside a family trust that could never be claimed, borrowed against, or sold without my written approval. She had left detailed instructions for the attorney, Eleanor, and even the security guard because she believed one day I would need a place where nobody could pressure me, manipulate me, or convince me that love had a price tag. In her letter she wrote something I will never forget. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means life has shown you the difference between people who welcome your heart and people who welcome your usefulness. Never confuse the two again." I sat on that porch watching the sunrise over the water with tears quietly rolling down my face, not because I had inherited a house, but because for the first time in my life someone had planned for my future without expecting anything in return. Over the following weeks I settled into the beach house while searching for a new job. The peaceful mornings slowly replaced the fear I had carried for years. Then one afternoon my phone began ringing non-stop. My parents had finally discovered the truth. They hadn't found out through me. They found out after trying to contact my grandmother's attorney, believing the property would eventually become part of the family estate. Instead, they learned it already belonged to me. My father called first, speaking more kindly than he had in years. My mother left emotional voicemails saying they had made mistakes and wanted to start over. Nathan sent a message saying family should never stay divided for long. A week later all three of them appeared at the front gate of Seabrook Beach House asking if they could come inside. I walked onto the porch and looked at them standing together exactly as they had stood the night they watched me leave. The only difference was that this time I was the one deciding whether the door would open. My father apologized for asking me to leave. My mother cried and said they had only wanted me to become stronger. Nathan admitted he should have defended me but chose the easier path instead. I listened without interrupting because genuine apologies deserve to be heard. When they finished, I thanked